What I'm about to tell you is going to change the way that you look at AI forever. It's not going to be pleasant to hear, but it's going to be very important. I want to make sure that everybody has a chance to receive this and to completely understand it. I'll start with the fact that everything everybody's been talking about when it comes to the Epstein files is wrong, dead wrong. And the real issue with Epstein hasn't even bubbled to the surface yet. It's a much deeper, darker story. It starts in 2002 and it involves some of the most famous tech billionaires we have in our country today: Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Larry Page. Now, I'm not one to bring you conspiracy theories. Everything I'm about to tell you is 100% absolutely true, and it's vetted, and it's unfortunate, and it is our new reality. If you spend your day on artificial intelligence, if you regularly log into ChatGPT, if you ask it questions and you receive answers and it tells you how to do your job on a daily basis, there is a very real chance, based on what I'm about to tell you during this episode, that technology is changing your life for the worse, not the better. And I'm going to bring you the story of the new eugenics Jeffrey Epstein, the godfather of artificial intelligence. There was a DARPA program. For those who don't know what DARPA is, it's the CIA-backed research wing that does a lot of research into technology, and it's been the godfather of many very famous technologies, including Facebook, as I'm about to show you right now. DARPA LifeLog was a program that was launched by DARPA. You can go online and look for the request for proposal. The design of this program was supposed to capture all Americans' information, put it into a LifeLog, track it, build it over time, so that you can create an electronic database of every American and, in fact, almost everybody in the world. Well, when congressional hearings started related to LifeLog, it was quickly killed by DARPA. Why? Because it came to the surface, because people learned about it, and because people became very concerned about the impact of all of their information online. This was 2003. This was back when we were a little bit more concerned about what we put into the computer. We weren't too far away from dial-up modems, and AOL and Bill Gates was still a name that was regularly talked about. As soon as LifeLog became public, DARPA quickly killed it, and they killed it on February 4th, 2004. That date is significant because that's also the date that a young hoodie-clad Mark Zuckerberg sitting in a Harvard dorm room launched what he called then the Facebook. The Facebook was designed as just a Harvard campus project. That's all Mark Zuckerberg intended it to be. But then, of course, he met the Wielvos brothers, two relatively wealthy and backed individuals who worked with him on the project. And if you believe the movies, Mark Zuckerberg went in a different direction than the Wielvos twins. But that's not the real story. The real story is right after Facebook launched, it got tens of thousands of users. 50% of them were on Harvard campus, and it struggled to get off the ground in other campuses. It wasn't until a tech CEO, Peter Thiel, then of PayPal, and a relatively famous figure in the Conservative Party now today, came to Mark Zuckerberg, a relatively unknown individual on Harvard campus, and offered him $500,000. Now, the one thing that you should all understand about Peter Thiel is at that point he was what's called an angel investor, but he was a different kind of angel investor. He actually paid individuals to drop out of college and commit themselves to his causes. Thiel's Club has launched some of the most famous tech startups. He's been behind nearly every single one of them. Reid Hoffman with LinkedIn was started right around this time period. Now, if we go back and look at Peter Thiel and say, why did he spend $500,000 on this project? Why was he one of the first venture capitalists? Why was he offering this kind of money to people like Mark Zuckerberg? You have to understand about what he built at that point in time. You see, Peter Thiel was the founder of a program called Palantir. Palantir is the connector, Palantir is the brain, but the brain doesn't have the data that it needs in order to figure out artificial intelligence. Palantir is a company that takes existing information and it connects that information together to draw conclusions. It's been going for a very long time. I used it when I was in the Marine Corps in Afghanistan, and I've spoken widely about Palantir because of how much I know about it. But Palantir is nothing unless it has users to put in data. That's where LifeLog came into play. The intent was people like John Podexter of DARPA, the CIA, and the US Military Department of Defense felt that they would be able to just get a project to collect this information that was government funded. But when there was pushback by the American public, they had to go a different way. And DARPA playboy Peter Thiel decided to go the way of a young hoodie-clad college kid to get the information that he deeply sought to make the connections he needed in order to control so much about our environment. For those of you who think the rags to riches story of Mark Zuckerberg is some amazing tale that we should tell our grandchildren, think again. Just about every social media entrepreneur back in the day of Peter Thiel's tech startups was blessed by DARPA. Why didn't MySpace win over Facebook? It didn't have DARPA backing. Why did LinkedIn win over the dozens and dozens of programs that were available that did similar things around that time? It was because of Peter Thiel and DARPA. Why did Instagram become so big? Peter Thiel and DARPA. Spotify. Peter Thiel and DARPA. Just about every single aspect of your digital life, Peter Thiel and DARPA backed blessing people in exchange for one thing, a backdoor of information to be collected from users, cell phone location, and a tremendous amount of user data. Now, what does this have to do with Jeffrey Epstein? That's the curious part. A lot of people aren't aware that Jeffrey Epstein is one of the first godfathers of artificial intelligence. Back in 2002, he had a conference where he supported some of the most famous names in artificial intelligence who were intending to solve a problem at that time. If you wanted a clean, reassuring origin story for modern artificial intelligence, you'd probably start with a university lab, a whiteboard, and a grad student surviving on ramen noodles. You'd not start with a private Caribbean island owned by Jeffrey Epstein. And yet, in the spring of 2002, a group of prominent computer scientists met with Epstein on his property for what was dubbed a common sense symposium. This was later documented in a 2003 AI magazine paper that Epstein for his generous support. What were all these AI researchers gathering for? It was to solve a problem in AI. The topic itself was academically respectable. How to give machines the everyday common sense humans use consistently without even noticing. The venue for solving this problem was uniquely Epstein, and it's the kind of venue that institutional ethics would be very concerned about. The 2002 symposium, located in the Virgin Islands, founded by Jeffrey Epstein, was a gathering that was later described in print one that brought together the most influential artificial intelligence figures, including Marvin Minsky, MIT's AI lab founder Ken Ford, NASA, and DARPA ties. Their shared goal was technical to solve the common sense problem. The gap between machines that can recognize patterns and machines that can reason like a normal human being about normal human things, like why you shouldn't store ice cream in the oven. This is very important because the common sense problem has always been a butt of AI. It was never really addressed, but it failed many projects. Pattern recognition can be astonishing. Reasoning about the world like a person, that's where AI tends to trip up. And in order to solve the common sense problem, it's common sense that you need a lot of money. And that's where Jeffrey Epstein was very skilled. Some people, in fact, said that he collected scientists like some people might collect art. Why was he doing all of this? Well, it's because he had his own nefarious motives. So in 2002, the AI researchers gather, they talk, a paper is published that thanks Jeffrey Epstein for all of the support, and then the researchers scatter the globe and start working in their individual tech companies, and out springs Facebook, LinkedIn. The technology from PayPal spiraled across the globe and started collecting data for Peter Thiel and Jeffrey Epstein himself. But Jeffrey Epstein didn't stop there. According to MIT's commissioned investigation, Epstein donated roughly $850,000 to MIT between 2002 and 2017. After the Virgin Islands meeting, it was very important that this research gets done, and Jeffrey Epstein paid for it, but he paid a lot more to others. He even paid $750,000 to MIT after his 2008 conviction that everybody's well aware of. Now, the donations to MIT palled in comparison to what he purportedly gave to Harvard. Harvard had an investigation after it was found that they received such a large donation from Jeffrey Epstein, $6.5 million donated by Jeffrey Epstein, most of it in the hands of a researcher named Martin Novak. I'm going to talk a bit about Martin Novak because he's very important here. Martin Novak was the founder of the PED laboratory at Harvard. This was the laboratory that Jeffrey Epstein had a private office in. He had a swipe card and access to the entire building. And even after his conviction, he was able to visit many times, over 40 times. The PED laboratory was part of the program for evolutionary dynamics. Now, you could hear the words evolutionary dynamics and think that this is a groundbreaking concept, but what it really is a dressed up version of eugenics. Martin Novak is originally a mathematician, and most of his research was based on the idea of cooperation, why some parts of the species might cooperate with others even if it ultimately leads to their own demise. You see, people like Epstein and Novak were absolutely obsessed with the future of the human race and the problems of the human race that are caused by reverse Darwinism. The idea that as we become more technologically advanced, we as a people will begin to fail. And I think to some extent we do see some of that evidence present, but they took it to an extreme extent. Investigations later described Epstein as being physically present, treated as a known quantity, and given institutional accommodations that go well beyond a pat on the back and thanks for your support and look a lot more like integration into Harvard itself. With Jeffrey Epstein entrenched at Pede and also at MIT, he had commanded respect in two of the most important institutions that were developing research in the area of AI and ultimately eugenics. MIT's Media Laboratory famously referred to Jeffrey Epstein as Voldemort, or the one who should not be named. They avoided saying his name because they knew who he was, they knew what he was about, but they just couldn't stop taking his money for research. The logic's almost poetic in its candor. If a donor's name must not be spoken, everyone already knows where the money is. If the plan is anonymous and not publicized, the institution's admitting it's not proud of where it's getting its donations. Epstein had positioned himself globally as a connector, and certainly inside of the United States as a connector in many different institutions, but he was ultimately the funer of artificial intelligence and this sort of research. Starting in 2002 in the Virgin Islands, moving forward to large donations, he kept very firm relationships at MIT and Harvard even after his convictions. But what's more troubling are some of the statements that Jeffrey Epstein would later make that reveal what he was really trying to develop with all of these donations. Now you might say, okay, Ron, what's the connection between Jeffrey Epstein, Facebook, and DARPA? And that's where a gentleman named John Poe Dexter comes into play. He's a former NASA director who led DARPA. He led the Information Awareness Office. He was actually the founder of the Information Awareness Program that I mentioned to you earlier. He founded the Total Information Awareness Initiative. That was the program designed to get information on nearly every single American citizen. And of course, when that went out of favor, he had to find a way to get Americans to willingly give up the information themselves. And according to Wired's reporting, Poe Dexter met with Peter Thiel and Palantir co-founder Alex Karp in 2004 and told them that he had an interesting idea to apply data mining techniques from fraud detection to counterterrorism operations. Experts like Poe Dexter were really trying to solve post-911 problems, and that's where total information awareness came about. Of course, they had the benefit of a law passed by Congress at the time that George Bush was president and signed by President Bush, allowing almost complete access to the public's information and instilling FISA courts. At that point in time, the government was at the most powerful. The CIA, DARPA would be able to get as much information as they possibly could. And with the aid of Facebook, and fast forward over 20 years, CIA officials would tell you that the #1 source of information on the American public are apps like Facebook, Spotify, and LinkedIn. Shortly after, we would learn that Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn, would sponsor a dinner in Palo Alto, placing Epstein at the table with Musk, Zuckerberg, and Thiel, all of which who would move forward and champion cryptocurrency as a tool for the future. They realize that the information is great, but the financial system is still tied to governments, and deleveraging the financial system from the government would allow this sort of technocrat explosion to occur and ultimately give them the power that they need. Now, great, you've got Bitcoin spiraling forward. You've got all of the information that you want on Americans. You have them willingly giving over their information, and you no longer need the Total Information Awareness Program. You're moving forward full steam ahead. But then a gentleman named Edward Snowden, who I once would have villainized, but now I might consider championing, came forward with information about a program called PRISM. I've done episodes before on the startup of PRISM and how that came from a software that was stolen by the government around the time that Bill Clinton was in office, had the ability to connect information on all Americans and also collect information overseas. Edward Snowden was a whistleblower and told us how the CIA and the NSA would have the ability to collect information on every single American through all the digital devices that they had. That's where your information from Facebook was going. Now, there's a law that prevents America from spying on its own citizens, but when they give that information up willingly, all you need is a back door. That's one of the reasons why it was so important for Peter Thiel and John Poe Dexter to start these sorts of operations. That's another reason why Donald Trump pushed so hard along with Joe Biden and a unanimous effort to try to reduce TikTok in the United States. You see, if your government has control of Facebook, if your government has control of Google and the Chinese don't have control of those, you're safe. But when a Chinese application starts to come into the United States and collect just as much information, that spells problems. In fact, I think what we did with TikTok is almost the greatest admission that your government is behind the information collection of Facebook and Google. And so, of course, Edward Snowden blows the whistle. We finally learn what PRISM is, and some of the information that we can gain from that is absolutely alarming, but that still wasn't a signal that it was used domestically, and we wouldn't find that out until the Cambridge Analytica scandal. I'm going to talk a bit about Cambridge Analytica, but I think it's important that we get to it in another episode as well. So make sure you hit like and subscribe on this one so that you can get notification of that. The Cambridge Analytica scandal, for those who don't know, started well before it hit the United States. You see, Facebook and Peter Thiel connected a backdoor inside of Facebook software. That backdoor allowed certain other institutions and entities to get a hold of information. Cambridge Analytica paid Facebook a lot of money for a contract that allowed it to get not just the information on the individual user, but also get information on their friends and data that might have been already located inside of their phone. That meant that when you logged into Facebook, Facebook was storing not just your data, not just your user data, but also data from the friends that you'd connected with, whether or not they'd opted in on those privacy settings. Facebook settled a very large lawsuit with its users and immediately tightened up after the scandal. But the problem is not just that Facebook leaked the information, it's why. You see, as you know, Peter Thiel was early in on the founding of Facebook. And those backdoors are very important, especially when they go to his friends. Now, most of you know that I'm a relatively conservative person, but I fight power wherever power is, especially if it gets corrupt. And I take issue with what happened here. So I hope you're a bit patient with me. Peter Thiel, a well-known conservative, but also somebody who believed that Brexit was a good thing, and also somebody who believed that Donald Trump should get in office in 2016. And while I will not say the Cambridge Analytica scandal was the result of Trump's presidency, what I will say is that it is the result of a database of information that very well can be used for bad. And it's very possible we may not have another free and fair election in our country's future. The founder of Cambridge Analytica was from a marketing firm, and he teamed up with a very smart programmer. They decided that they would try to influence some elections overseas, which was a great way to make a lot of investors a ton of money. They tried it on a few countries, Singapore and others. With some mixed results, they were refining it before they brought it into the UK and also to the United States. When they had almost 50,000 data points on every single American, enough to know just about everything about you, they decided to spring it loose to the highest bidder. What does that lead to? And what's the impact of that? Now, it's important that we wrap all of this together by discussing Epstein's worldview and the worldview of many of his supporters, including potentially Peter Thiel himself. I think that we can sum this up the best way by discussing a breakfast gathering at Jeffrey Epstein's 50,000 square foot mansion. He was surrounded by former heads of state executives from Google. He was in the presence of a former Israeli prime minister. When he was asked about Novak, about the Harvard research, he said something that was very curious. He informed this group of distinguished guests that Novak was doing research into cancer, but the way he explained it was very curious. He said, you know, when you want to find a suspected bad actor on the global stage, one of the things that you might want to do is collect all the information about them, the signals, the connections that they have with other people. He said that's the way that you would want to treat a cancer cell. And then one of the things that you want to do is you want to starve out that cell by destroying the connection. You see, in conversations with many high-ups, Jeffrey Epstein had repeatedly referred to this sort of eugenics in very odd ways. In many conversations, even with Novak himself, he referred to our species similar to the way that he would refer to biological organisms. And he would say things like, you know, dead organisms need to be washed away. Those that aren't useful to the body or useful to the system or are cancerous need to be wiped away. When he would talk about cancer, he was routinely not actually talking about cancer, but he was talking about those things that are harmful and no longer serve a purpose. Now, there's a lot of other things that you could say about Epstein. Certainly, he wasn't a very good guy. But one of the things that you should be very suspicious of is that he was the founder and, in fact, the influencer who originally started deep research into artificial intelligence and this sort of mindset that he shared along with Novak, along with Peter Thiel, the idea that democracy is dead, that humans are heading in the wrong direction, that there's going to be this rise of artificial intelligence technology that will likely take over, starts to get him and other people somewhat concerned that the human race is not up for the challenge. And that's where dangerous thinking starts to come into play about tuning the human race into something that might be sustainable. even if that isn't all of us. These were the same ideas that were shared by Nazis. These were some of the ideas that Adolf Hitler equated to Nietzsche's thinking that was essentially incorrect. It appeared that Jeffrey Epstein was really obsessed with the survival of the species. In fact, in an email between him and Ghislaine Maxwell talking about another individual who I won't name, she said, wait, she's key. She has all of the DNA research. Jeffrey Epstein was obsessed with freezing his sperm. And one of the things that he wanted to do was be able to recreate himself later. He was also obsessed with the way that organisms interact with each other through Novak's research, and he was obsessed with the way that society interacts. He was working on some very deep projects along with very intelligent individuals who all shared the same eugenicist mindset. But one thing's for sure, your use of AI, your use of artificial intelligence, putting information into the machines that we've been putting information into was not designed to help us or save us or help us do our jobs. It was designed to give pieces of your freedom over so that it could be observed, manipulated, and fed back to you in a way that allows individuals like this to control. Thank you so much for joining me on Peru.